thing that I found is that, I mean, people associate it with Western North Carolina. And in the early days of moonshine, it's the area where they're really cracking down, where the most moonshiners are Western North Carolina.
Moonshine, bootleggers, and speakeasies are all staple imagery of prohibition in the United States. In Western North Carolina, these illegal activities began early on, with Asheville being a leader in the state for citywide prohibition, reflecting public sentiments that would later lead to state, then national prohibition. On the eve of the October 8th referendum, anti-liquor religious leaders, men, women, and children paraded through the streets of Asheville campaigning for prohibition, while those that relied on the production and sale of alcohol, mostly business owners, met together to discuss and campaign for their side. The next day, the wets and the dries turned out for the vote. John O'Donnell, who owned and operated a saloon, went to the ballot and was surrounded by children who sang a shaming song that even named his children. He also reported seeing the women and children surrounding wet voters to implore them to vote differently, and even going so far as to rip the red ribbons off their shirts. Thomas Patton would succinctly sum up the events of the vote in his diary. Election over. Bad conduct on the part of the Prohibition ladies. Very distressing. Majority for Prohibition reported. Thus, the first step towards statewide prohibition was in motion, and the stage was set for those willing to shirk the law to find ways to continue producing and selling alcohol. Moonshiners would produce the illegal substance, while business owners such as John O'Donnell would find ways to continue running underground bars in cities such as Asheville.
The 1909 referendum was the result of a long battle against liquor, dating back to 1852 when the first petition that introduced the concept of prohibition was brought before the General Assembly. This did not result in legislation, but the movement slowly gained momentum, generating groups like the Anti-Saloon League, which held chapters all over the state. In 1903, the Watts Act was passed, banning the manufacture and sale of liquors outside of incorporated townships. This law was pushed by Democrats and primarily meant to target county distilleries. In fact, Democratic Senator Furnifold Simmons described county distilleries as Republican recruiting stations. In 1905, the Ward Law extended prohibition to towns with populations under 1,000, leading 68 counties out of 98 to become dry. Finally, in 1909, North Carolina became a dry state. Historian Michael Lewis asserts that prohibition represented a response by mostly rural, but some urban, middle-class, native-born evangelical Protestants. It was a response to the dramatic changes in the United States in the early 20th century.
The 1909 referendum especially affected the moonshiners in North Carolina. Legal distillers had felt considerable competition from illegal moonshiners in the years leading up to Prohibition, but after the referendum passed, the consumers depended completely on illegal activity for their liquor. The demand for alcohol was still the same, but now that legal distilleries were out of business, the demand for moonshine boomed. This boom caused moonshiners to change their tactics in a number of ways. As demand went up, production went up, and moonshining had to expand as a business. Now the small farmers who distilled often sold their entire batch to men known as kingpins. These kingpins bought the moonshine from the blockaders and acted as middlemen as they distributed the moonshine to further regions without actually distilling the product themselves. Moonshine thus became more of a business and created more jobs after the referendum passed, even though it was now completely illegal. The large demand for this illegal alcohol in North Carolina also changed the way whiskey was distilled. As historian Daniel Pierce said, the thumb keg was created and was able to save, quote, the distiller a tremendous amount of time and effort, end quote, since it quickened the process of making a finished product of liquor. Since the blockaders could now keep up with the skyrocketing demand of moonshine, their profits increased considerably, especially in western North Carolina.
But it's in western North Carolina for a number of reasons, because people had made it, the Scots-Irish, they had made it, they brought that skill with them. They adapted it to using corn. But also, and they're poor, And you got plenty of places to hide stills, you know, in Western North Carolina.
The prohibition in North Carolina was closely tied to the developing middle class of the state, who strongly supported the New South movement as a whole and felt that prohibition would help improve the moral and economic development of the state. North Carolina's self-appointment as the head of the Southern Prohibition movement heavily promoted the cause within the state and caused prohibition to drag on after the end of national prohibition in 1933. In 1935, the state finally began relaxing its laws around prohibition by allowing a popular referendum for 70 counties on whether or not to remain a dry county. Because the state legislature was concerned about the flow of revenue to South Carolina and Virginia, which had legalized alcohol sale. The state did not open its first state-run ABC store until 1937, 4 years after the end of national prohibition. It would take until 1978 for liquor to be allowed to be able to be sold at restaurants and clubs, a full 45 years after the end of national prohibition.